All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to another explainer. Today we're heading out on what I can literally only describe as a massive philosophical detective story. We are going to explore the ultimate nature of God by looking at some of the most profound metaphysical and theological source texts in history. We'll see how different traditions have tried to define the undefinable. And specifically, we're going to examine an incredible argument found across our sources that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity isn't just some abstract theological puzzle, but actually the most coherent metaphysical framework for understanding a truly infinite God. But before we dive into the heavy metaphysics, we really have to start with a fundamental problem. Think about it. How can a finite mind contain an infinite God? Thinkers like René Descartes and St. John of Damascus framed this exact issue so perfectly. Descartes pointed out that our human intellects fundamentally struggle to grasp a truly infinite creator. I mean, we have ideas of limited, everyday things, but infinity? That's a concept that completely shatters our boundaries. St. John of Damascus totally agreed, arguing that God's true nature is ultimately limitless and incomprehensible. Because we are created and changeable, trying to map out the uncreated and unchangeable is kind of like trying to pour the entire ocean into a tiny teacup. And that brings us to this powerful quote from our sources. We cannot worship an infinite God that our finite mind is able to fully contain. So what does this all mean? Well, the crucial takeaway here is that the very fact we have to use complex, mind-bending metaphysics to describe God actually proves the vast gap between his infinite being and our limited understanding. Honestly, if we could perfectly define God and put him in a neat little human logic box, that being wouldn't really be infinite, would it? The complexity we're about to explore is a feature, not a bug, of interacting with the divine. Moving into Section 1, God's metaphysical nature, defining the intangible. Okay, so the absolute most important rule here is the concept of divine simplicity. According to theologians like Thomas Aquinas, God is not made of parts. Everything in our physical universe is a composite, right? It's made of matter and form, and it's subject to change and decay. But God is the uncaused first cause. If God were made of parts, like a giant metaphysical Lego set, he would depend on whatever put those parts together. Therefore, God must be a single, perfectly unified, and immutable or unchanging spiritual being. He is pure existence. The Belgic Confession really hits the nail on the head here, affirming a single and simple spiritual being. And this perfectly illustrates a brilliant concept highlighted in Credo magazine. Think of God's simple, unified essence like pure white light. When that white light passes through the prism of human revelation, it bursts out into this beautiful rainbow of different colors. Those colors are what we call God's attributes, so things like his love, his power, his justice. God isn't a collection of these attributes just taped together. His essence and his attributes are exactly one and the same. We're just viewing them from our fragmented, finite perspective. Section 2. Testing the competitors. Strict monotheism versus relationality. Now, when we compare theological models side by side based on our texts, we run into a really fascinating dilemma. In strict monotheistic frameworks, like the Islamic Tawhid model, for example, unity means absolute singularity. God is completely incomparable and distant. To protect his majesty, he cannot cross over into the human world directly, so he reveals his will, not himself, through intermediaries like angels and prophets. But the sources point out an apologetic dilemma here. An absolutely singular, non-relational God becomes historically distant and unknowable. The Trinitarian model resolves this historical distance entirely by proposing that God is being in communion. He is perfectly unified and simple, yes, for sure, but eternally relational and self-giving within his very nature. Theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg argues that a purely singular, transcendental subjectivity, the God of the philosophers, just cannot easily reconcile infinite transcendence with active presence or eminence in the world. Pannenberg suggests that to solve this massive problem, a differentiated unity is required. A Trinitarian concept actually allows the Father to be infinitely transcendent, while the Son and Spirit can be actively present with creation, and it does all of this without breaking the unity of the divine essence. It's a pretty elegant solution. All right, Section 3, the Trinitarian solution, a relational ontology. To truly understand the Trinity metaphysically, philosopher Robert Dreyer's framework tells us we have to distinguish between the what and the who. This is absolutely crucial. The what is the single divine essence. It's one pure active being, an undivided nature shared completely by all persons. But the who refers to the relations of origin, The Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds. So they share the exact same what, but they are uniquely distinct in their who. So you might be wondering, how do these subsistent relations actually work? Well, in this model, the relationships themselves are ultimate. The Father, Son, and Spirit aren't just different masks God wears, which is a concept called modalism, and they certainly aren't three separate gods, which is tritheism. They are real relations. The sources use this beautiful Greek term here, perichoresis. It basically means mutual indwelling. Picture an eternal embrace of love where Father, Son, and Spirit eternally give the fullness of divine life to one another. God's simplicity isn't some static, frozen isolation. It's a dynamic unity of self-giving love. Love isn't just something God does, it's what God is. As Robert Dreyer's text concludes, the God who is pure act is the God who so loved the world that he gave his only Son. The one God is triune love revealed in Christ. So here is the amazing payoff of our philosophical detective story. There aren't two gods. There isn't one abstract, distant God of reason and one personal God of faith. The metaphysical absolute and the deeply personal God are exactly the same being. Section 4. Biblical Blueprint, the Trinity in Action. Now, shifting gears slightly, according to theologian Lorenzo Palan, the New Testament has a very distinct relational heartbeat. The overarching pattern we see again and again is always this: the Father sends, the Son accomplishes, and the Spirit empowers. This rapid-fire narrative rhythm shows us that the Trinity isn't meant to be just an abstract math puzzle debated by philosophers in an ivory tower. It is the actual functional architecture of salvation described in the Christian texts. We literally see the Trinity as an enacted reality throughout history. In creation, the Father creates through his Word and by his Spirit. In the Incarnation, the Son is sent to actually embody that divine love in human history. And at Pentecost, the Spirit is poured out. The sources heavily emphasize that the doctrine of the Trinity wasn't just imposed onto the Bible out of nowhere. Rather, it's the natural result of letting the Bible's overarching story speak for itself. It is one grand mission, executed by three distinct persons sharing one divine essence. And finally, Section 5, Embracing the Ultimate Mystery. St. John of Damascus reminds us that there are two distinct ways we talk about God. First, there's apophatic theology, which is understanding God by what he is not. So he is uncreated, immutable, infinite. Then there's cataphatic theology, which is understanding God by what he is. Things like creator, all-powerful, and loving. Now, while we can use cataphatic terms to map out God's relational love and the framework of the Trinity, his ultimate essence remains wrapped in profound apophatic mystery. Let's be real, our finite minds can literally only grasp the very edges of the infinite. And this brings us to a deeply humbling quote from Gregory of Nazianzus: "The begetting of God must be honored by silence." The sources all basically agree that all of our human analogies, whether we're talking about the sun and its rays, or water and ice, or the parts of a human mind, they all eventually break down. The ultimate goal of Trinitarian metaphysics is absolutely not intellectual mastery. We aren't meant to figure God out and put him in a logical box. The goal, ultimately, is just worship and awe. I want to leave you with a final thought to really chew on. If these sources are right, and the ultimate reality of the universe, God's very being, is an eternal exchange of relational love, well, what does that actually mean for us? Humans are said to be made in the image of this exact God. So are you living your life in isolation, or are you living in communion? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the metaphysical mystery of the Trinity. Keep exploring, keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.